Hey guys, tonight we're unlocking the iron door to one of the most misunderstood and mythologized contraptions in history, the medieval chastity belt. You're crouched beside a dim hearth in a cold stone chamber, holding up a rusty iron undergarment that looks like it belongs in a dungeon rather than a wardrobe. The air smells of soot and old leather, and the soft creak of hinges makes you wonder who wore this, and for how long. Spoiler, it probably wasn't as long, or for the reasons you think. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Always love seeing those sleepy check-ins from around the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You crouch closer, iron in hand. The chastity belt is stiff and cold, and definitely not designed for comfort. No elastic, no breathable fabric, just a medieval metalwork that turns underwear into armor. The image of a poor maiden being locked into one of these contraptions before her knight trotted off to war might be burned into your imagination. But you'll want to loosen your mental belt a bit, because reality doesn't quite match the myth. Historians still argue whether chastity belts were ever widely used during the actual Middle Ages or if they were a later Renaissance invention, or even just elaborate jokes displayed in 19th century museums. Most surviving examples? Victorian-era fakes. Shocking, right? It's like finding out the Holy Grail was a souvenir mug. Still, the concept of controlling female sexuality wasn't exactly fictional. While the iron belt itself may have been more theatrical than practical, the idea of keeping women pure through external control absolutely was real and disturbingly creative. In some households, strict surveillance took the place of hardware. Think chaperones, curfews, and entire architectures designed to separate daughters from temptation. A literal tower was sometimes involved. In noble courts, fathers might guard the only key to a metaphorical or symbolic belt, keeping daughters under lock and key until marriage. And when keys were involved, they weren't always metaphorical. Some chastity belts had padlocks, complete with keychains worn around the necks of husbands. It's the original Find My iPhone, but more possessive and far less hygienic. Speaking of hygiene, yikes. Early depictions show belts with tiny air holes or slits for urination and menstruation, but the practicality? Debatable. Prolonged wear would have caused infections, sores, and at worst, death. There's a reason metal and bodily functions aren't besties. You're basically inviting tetanus to the party. And yet, the fear of female desire ran so deep that even pretending this method worked gave some men peace of mind. In fact, some scholars believe that the belts were less about real usage and more about symbolizing male anxiety over female autonomy. That's right. This whole torturous design might have been a medieval humble brag about control. Now picture yourself in a bustling Florentine market in the 1400s. A merchant hawks modesty devices with an unsettling wink. Did they mean it seriously? Was it gag gift territory? Or a threat wrapped in iron? No one agrees, but some private collectors swear by 15th century models with etchings and velvet-lined interiors, faux luxury at its most unnerving. And then there's the artistic angle. Chastity belts appear in illuminated manuscripts and woodcuts, but often with a satirical tone. One common image, a man returning home to find his wife's belt removed and hanging on the bedpost. The implication? Let's just say locksmiths were very well paid. Of course, not all belts were for women. Oh no. Some devices were created for men to prevent nocturnal emissions or immoral dreams. Picture an iron jockstrap with spikes. Now unsee it. Go ahead, I'll wait. What really sells the weirdness is how the chastity belt became a kind of meme before memes existed. It symbolized fear of lust, fear of women, and fear of what happens when you combine the two. And like any good meme, it went viral, traveling through time to appear in plays, cartoons, and even early 20th century educational films. Who knew medieval anxiety had such long legs? So, as you sit there imagining a rusty iron belt under layers of wool, ask yourself, was this really a widespread tool of sexual repression, or just history's version of a medieval punchline? Either way, the sound of that key turning in a heavy lock still sends a shiver down your spine. You gently place the belt down, careful not to let the latch snap shut. Somewhere in the distance, you swear you hear a faint clink. Maybe a ghost key, maybe just your imagination. Either way, welcome to the strange, suspicious, and surprisingly theatrical world of medieval desire. You slip away from the belt, leaving its cold echo behind, and move toward a darker, quieter corridor, one that smells of candle wax, musty stone, and faintly of secrets. The monastery walls rise high above you, casting long shadows. You pass under a wooden arch and hear faint chanting, but your mind's drawn to something else, the silent tension that clings to this holy place like incense. You're not the only one. Tucked behind stained glass windows and beneath starched habits, many monks and nuns found themselves tangled in a rather unholy web of desires. Because, and here's the kicker, just because you take a vow doesn't mean your libido clocks out with you. Historians still argue whether the level of sexual activity within medieval monasteries has been exaggerated over time, but there's no denying the records are juicy, and not always figuratively. Between accidental confessions, penance logs, and scandalous reports, the inner workings of cloisters start to resemble a medieval soap opera, with less armor and more guilt. You imagine yourself peeking into a nun's cell, simple cot, wooden cross, a single candle burning low. But beneath that simplicity? Complexity. Nuns were often placed into convents young, sometimes as political pawns. Not always voluntarily. And when you combine repression, isolation, and no meaningful outlet, well, desire becomes a quiet rebellion. One of the most infamous examples comes from 14th century Saxony, where an entire nunnery was shut down after repeated pregnancies. Miracles, they claimed, but the bishops were not convinced. Nuns blamed it on demonic visitations. Which, sure, because blaming your affair on a shape-shifting demon was the 1300s version of "I was hacked." Monks weren't much better. The rule of Saint Benedict may have outlawed all carnal thoughts, but monks were still human and sometimes very creative. Some monastic orders included flagellation as a spiritual cleansing ritual, which often blurred the lines between penitence and pleasure. Remember those flagellants from earlier? They weren't just beating themselves for show. Fringe reports even suggest some monks shared beds for warmth. But the margins of medieval rulebooks contain complaints about excessive closeness during these snuggly arrangements. You try not to picture Brother Matthew spooning Brother Anselm, but it's already there. And what about the libraries? Oh yes, you think of dusty books and silent studying, but in some monasteries, illuminated manuscripts contain not just scripture but creative marginalia. Doodles of naughty figures, phallic creatures, and other imaginative absurdities. One manuscript from England features a nun harvesting penises from a tree, basket in hand. No explanation, no footnotes. Just a weirdly cheerful harvest season. Some monasteries even had secret passageways connecting male and female quarters, allegedly for spiritual cooperation, but if the walls could talk, they'd blush. In one notorious case from Avignon, the church launched an investigation after a local bishop got wind of monks making regular moonlight trips through a tunnel. The monks said it was for joint midnight prayers. The church, of course, cracked down hard when caught. Public penance, exile, or even imprisonment could follow if you were discovered mid-tryst in your robes. But, predictably, the threat of hellfire didn't always outmatch the pull of curiosity or chemistry. And this tension created its own flavor of obsession. There were confession manuals filled with questions that would make even modern therapists raise an eyebrow. Priests asked detailed inquiries like, "Have you touched yourself while thinking of your sisters in Christ?" Very specific, very uncomfortable. But here's where it gets even stranger. Some orders tried to regulate these urges by issuing rules about diet. It was believed that certain foods, meat, wine, and even garlic, could inflame lust. So monks were put on bland diets of grains, legumes, and boiled vegetables. Basically the medieval equivalent of a cold shower. Quirkier still, in one 13th century German abbey, a nun wrote a love poem to the Virgin Mary that scholars still debate today. Devotional? Romantic? Or something more intimate? The lines blur often in medieval writing, and nowhere more so than in cloistered hearts. It wasn't all illicit though. Some monks and nuns had sincere spiritual connections, emotional bonds that carried them through years of hardship. But even the most pious sometimes slipped. One famous monk, Peter Abelard, fell deeply in love with Heloise, a nun. Their letters survive, and they range from tearful longing to straight-up medieval sexts. No kidding. "Your image is engraved in my soul," he writes. Sweet. "I dreamed last night you lay beside me unclothed." Less sweet. After their scandal broke, Abelard was castrated, and both were sent back to religious life. Their love letters continued, though spanning years. And centuries later they were buried side by side. Call it tragic, call it romantic, or call it the most painful breakup ever recorded. And as you slowly walk past the chapel, you notice a worn bench where the confession line once sat. Maybe you sit for a moment, listening to the stillness. The air is heavy with incense and memory. These walls have seen secrets traded like relics, whispered like psalms. Desire doesn't vanish with a vow. It sneaks in through the cracks, curls beneath habits, and waits in the corners of candlelit rooms. Whether demon, daydream, or forbidden glance, it finds a way. You step back out into the daylight now, at least what passes for daylight under a sky heavy with soot and chimney smoke. You're in a medieval courtyard, surrounded by silk-clad nobles, wandering troubadours, and an alarming number of very determined pigeons. Everyone here is flirting, subtly, awkwardly, and occasionally in rhymed couplets. Welcome to the weird world of courtly love, where seduction comes with a lute solo and eyebrow-raising isn't just encouraged, it's practically foreplay. Let's start with the basics. Courtly love was a romantic code practiced mainly among the aristocracy from the 12th century onward. But here's the kicker, it wasn't necessarily about sex. No, this was more about longing. Angsty, dramatic eye contact across the ballroom longing. Imagine modern dating, but everyone's read too much Chaucer and no one's allowed to say how they really feel. You take a slow turn and notice the fashion, tight bodices, flowing gowns, and something protruding. Yes, the codpiece, that magnificent, pouch-like flap sewn onto the front of a man's trousers, designed to cover, emphasize, and often embellish the genital region. It wasn't subtle. Some were padded. Others were jeweled. One particularly bold knight reportedly had his shaped like a miniature unicorn. Confidence? Delusion? Historians still argue whether it was fashion, protection, or a weird flex. And the ladies? They had their own visual language. A bare neck suggested availability. Plucked eyebrows and high foreheads were all the rage. Yes, they literally tweezed their hairlines back. What? Because a high, smooth brow showed intelligence and virtue. Or possibly alien ancestry. Jury's out. This society didn't operate on Tinder swipes. It had rules like a feudal instruction manual for seduction. One must love from afar. The lady must appear unattainable. And if, heaven forbid, you actually touched each other before a dozen poems were exchanged and a joust was held in your honor, scandal. Troubadours played a huge role. These traveling musicians would sing ballads celebrating the virtues of some lord's wife, often while trying to woo her themselves. Love letters were another currency of passion. Long-winded, overly poetic, and filled with metaphors so tortured they should have filed for asylum. Your eyes are twin suns that scorch my soul with longing. Easy there, Jeffrey. Get some water. But behind the layers of chivalry and lace-gloved restraint, things got weird. One noblewoman in 14th century France reportedly required all her suitors to duel over who could write her the best sonnet. The loser? Banished from her garden party forever. Because nothing says love like competitive rhyming and a mild threat of social exile. And yes, eventually, some of these relationships did become physical, though usually behind layers of secrecy, symbolism, and anxiety. Remember, many courtly love affairs involved married women and men they were not married to, which made things risky. And if you believe the poetry, all the more passionate. Apparently, nothing boosts libido like the looming threat of public disgrace and dungeon time. Now let's talk gestures. A dropped handkerchief might be deliberate. A glance over a fan? A declaration of war. Touching gloves? Scandalous. In fact, gloves were a full-on obsession. Knights would often carry a lady's glove into battle as a token, like a scented, embroidered safety blanket. Some even tied them to their armor. Nothing screams masculinity like wearing your crush's mittens on the battlefield. Historians still debate how widespread actual affairs were. Was this all symbolic, a courtly pastime to pass the time between plague outbreaks? Or was there a thriving underground of aristocratic trysts cleverly hidden beneath etiquette and poetry? Probably a mix of both. And if you're picturing these nobles as graceful, poised beings, let's shatter that image for a second. Hygiene wasn't exactly dazzling. Perfume disguised more than it accentuated. Breath mints weren't a thing. And yet, there they were, writing odes to each other's sugar lips and rosy cheeks. Just try not to think too hard about what those cheeks had been exposed to. One particularly quirky tidbit. There was a custom in some regions where lovers would sit on opposite sides of a large bed and whisper confessions while a chaperone sat between them. Talk about a third wheel. Imagine trying to woo someone while Father Bartholomew knits socks beside you. Still, the rules weren't all stiff and ceremonial. Some games were playful. In noble courts, there were courts of love, presided over by queens or noble ladies. These were mock trials where disputes about romance were argued and judged. Should Sir Gaspard have sent Lady Imelda 2 roses instead of 3? What punishment does an overly clingy knight deserve? Possibly having to compose a sad ballad and perform it on a lute shaped like a fish. And yet, for all the ritual and rigidity, this system offered something rare in the medieval world. especially for women. A space, however contrived, where emotion was celebrated, where a noble woman could wield some power over her suitor and even, if the stars aligned, choose whom to favor. In a time where most women were traded in marriage like livestock, courtly love gave a whiff of autonomy. You pass under a draped balcony now, catching the faint aroma of roses and candle smoke. Somewhere, a minstrel plucks at a lute string. You hear the soft rustle of parchment, another bad poem, likely written in haste after a single smile. Because in the medieval court, even a glance could become legend. And so, you move on, dodging a pigeon and adjusting your metaphorical codpiece. Love may have worn silk and spoken in riddles back then, but it was still hungry, nervous, and very, very human. Now you're walking under a sky darkened not by clouds, but by the slow roll of self-inflicted penance. You feel the drumbeat before you see them. Barefoot men and women, backs exposed, chanting prayers as they strike themselves with whips. The leather lashes sliced through the air with rhythmic desperation. Welcome to the world of flagellants, where pain wasn't just a punishment, it was a pathway to purity. Or, in some corners, something far stranger. They march slowly, robes tied loosely at the waist, blood dripping onto cobbled streets. You might think it's all about spiritual discipline, but then you notice the glint in someone's eyes. Not just devotion. Something else. Something that hovers awkwardly between pain and pleasure. Flagellation wasn't exclusive to religious parades. Within monasteries and convents, it was a common form of self-discipline. The idea was simple: suffer like Christ, become closer to God. And yet, the more some practiced it, the more it started to look a lot less holy. Whispered rumors spread of monks who flogged themselves daily, not out of guilt but to cleanse impure thoughts. Thoughts that, ironically, were about the whipping itself. Historians still argue whether the erotic undertones were acknowledged by contemporaries or simply a modern projection. But when the same practice keeps cropping up in religious, poetic, and even romantic contexts, it raises eyebrows. And welts. You duck into a small stone chapel. Inside, a manuscript lays open to a depiction of Saint Dominic. He's flagellating himself, his face a mask of bliss and agony. Around him, angels watch approvingly. But over time, artists got bolder. By the 14th century, depictions of saints scourging themselves often veered into oddly intimate territory. You look again. Is that a smile? In some corners of medieval society, suffering was the only acceptable form of emotional release, especially for women. Noble ladies, denied outlets for power or pleasure, sometimes embraced ascetic pain as a way to escape the mundane. One particularly dramatic case? A 15th century nun who tied barbed wire around her thighs under her robes. Not just for Lent, for years. And she wasn't alone. Some orders even encouraged invisible suffering. Pain hidden under clothing, known only to God. But we both know how secrets have a way of leaking out. Back outside, the flagellants continue. A curious movement born during the Black Death. Town to town, they'd arrive barefoot and chanting, whipping themselves in public squares to atone for society's sins. They believed that suffering would end the plague. Spoiler alert, it didn't. But it sure made a dramatic show. Some accounts say women would faint watching them. Others say onlookers joined in, caught up in a frenzy of blood, fear, and fascination. You can almost hear the murmurs in the crowd. Some come for salvation. Others, for the spectacle. One fringe tidbit? In certain towns, the flagellant movement was so intense that children began imitating it in back alleys, whipping dolls, parroting Latin prayers, and then giggling. Medieval kids, just as weird as the adults. Now, don't assume this was all dark leather and gloom. There were moments of surreal comedy too. In a small Bohemian village, a local priest reportedly banned self-flagellation during Mass, not because it was sinful, but because someone accidentally flung their whip into the bishop's wine. Heavenly wrath? Nah, just poor aim. Eventually, the church had to step in. Pope Clement VI condemned the flagellant movement in 1349, calling it heretical. Why? Because people started skipping church in favor of whipping circles. It was crowdsourced penance, decentralized redemption, the medieval version of going rogue. But despite papal warnings, private acts of self-punishment persisted for centuries. Sometimes they were framed as devotion, other times as purification from lust. And still the lines kept blurring. A nobleman in late 15th century Florence kept a journal detailing every sinful dream he had, then recorded how many lashes he gave himself in response. The dreams got steamier. The lash count? Suspiciously inconsistent. The deeper you go into this world, the more you realize that for many, pain and desire weren't enemies. They were dance partners, carefully choreographed, quietly shared, and rarely spoken of above a whisper. You pass by a candlelit alcove now, where a small wooden scourge hangs next to a crucifix. It's smooth with use, not new. Someone gripped that handle nightly. For years. Was it repentance? Habit? Something else entirely? Even in art, the eroticism of suffering became coded into the culture. Look at medieval depictions of Christ, emaciated, wounded, eyes rolled upward. He's often painted with a delicacy that evokes more than just sorrow. Some mystics wrote long, passionate meditations on Christ's body, his blood, his wounds, the curve of his ribs. These weren't casual reflections. They were intimate, almost fevered. Of course, not all pain was self-inflicted. In courts of love, yes, those romantic ones from earlier, public humiliation could also be dished out as punishment. A rejected lover might be told to crawl through the castle in a donkey mask, or write poems while barefoot on frozen stone. Romantic? Not really. Memorable? Definitely. But the thread connecting all these acts, flagellation, humiliation, whispered dreams, is this: in a world where sexuality was boxed in, beaten down, and wrapped in guilt, some people found ways to feel something, even if it hurt. So, as you stand in the shadow of a crimson-robed flagellant, blood spotting the dusty stones, you wonder, was this devotion or desire in disguise? And in the silence that follows the final lash, you can almost hear the answer breathe through the wind. You leave the square where the air still hums with chanting and move toward a quieter part of town, a narrow stone alley that twists and turns like it's trying to keep secrets. And tonight's secret? Virginity. Or more specifically, what happened when someone's supposed purity needed proving. Welcome to the nerve-wracking, awkward, and sometimes downright bizarre world of virginity tests, stained sheets, and bedroom bureaucracy that made the medieval wedding night feel more like a courtroom trial. You push open a wooden door and step into a candlelit chamber. There's a bed in the middle of the room, its sheets crisp and white. Too white. And nearby, an elderly woman with a hawk-like stare is tightening her shawl. That's the matron, hired not for her warmth but for her watchfulness. Her job? To verify consummation. This is not a drill. Let's rewind a bit. In medieval Europe, virginity wasn't just about morality, it was a transactional asset. A noblewoman's reputation, her dowry, even the political ties of her family could rise or crumble depending on whether she was intact. And when that kind of pressure exists, you'd better believe people invented some questionable ways to measure it. The most common test involved the wedding night itself. After the couple did the deed, if they did it at all, the sheets were inspected for blood. A bloody sheet was the holy grail of medieval marriage. It served as proof of virginity, fertility, and the groom's virility all at once. Triple points. And sometimes those sheets weren't just quietly peeked at, they were paraded through town the next morning like a very awkward victory flag. Historians still argue whether these displays were widespread custom or more localized, but records show towns in Spain, France, and even England that expected public proof, especially in high-stakes marriages. Imagine marrying into power, then watching your laundry be waved at strangers as confirmation. Of course, not all bodies behave by the rules. Not every woman bleeds the first time, and not every couple manages to consummate under pressure. So what did the bride do if the sheet stayed spotless? Enter creative solutions. Some desperate brides pricked their fingers. Others kept vials of chicken blood. And yes, there's at least one documented case of someone bribing the laundry maid. What's a little medieval fraud between betrothed? Then there were physical inspections, often performed by midwives or senior women. They'd check for tightness, warmth, or the elusive hymen, which was often misunderstood. One guide claimed that a virgin's breath was colder and sweeter than a widow's. Another said virgins walked with shorter strides. One even suggested virgin girls could put their feet behind their heads without discomfort. You try that and get back to me. One fringe tidbit? In 15th century Venice, an entire panel of noble women was once summoned to investigate a young bride's failed virginity test. After poking, questioning, and pacing their conclusion, she is probably nervous. Modern gynecologists everywhere are shaking their heads. And while this pressure fell mainly on women, men weren't always off the hook. If a husband couldn't perform, he too could face public questioning, or worse, a trial by bedroom. In France, a man accused of impotence might be ordered to prove himself in front of witnesses, or even court officials. One nobleman famously fainted halfway through. Another reportedly shouted, "Success!" mid-act, which seems like a mood killer. You shuffle past a carved armoire and pause in front of a strange-looking seat. That's no ordinary chair. It's a fertility stool designed to assist women in proving they were fit for childbirth. A big part of consummation was also about ensuring heirs. These stools sometimes had holes in them, allowing midwives to perform uncomfortable inspections or rituals. And you thought your first date was bad. Sometimes, if a marriage was disputed, the couple would be ordered to lie together under observation, fully clothed with witnesses just a curtain away. It's called the bedding ceremony, and it wasn't optional. Imagine having to whisper sweet nothings while Uncle Richard stands outside muttering a prayer and making notes. The church, of course, had opinions. Virginity was celebrated in saints, martyrs, and the Virgin Mary herself. Women who preserved their chastity were often treated with more spiritual respect than those who didn't. But if a girl was too chaste, refusing to marry or showing too much independence, suspicion could grow. Virginity was a tightrope. Walk it wrong and people fell fast. And this obsession wasn't just cultural, it was economic. If a bride failed the test, her dowry could be reclaimed. The family might be shamed. Lawsuits could follow. In one wild case from 14th century Germany, a nobleman sued his bride for fraud and demanded the return of a castle. Over a sheet. But every rule makes space for rebellion. Some women found clever ways to resist. They hired sympathetic midwives, destroyed evidence, or sought quick marriages with friends or cousins to erase suspicion. Others simply ran. In one Italian village, a girl faked her own kidnapping rather than face a virginity test arranged by her father. It worked, sort of. She became a nun. And for those too poor to afford ceremony, the rules were simpler, but just as harsh. An unmarried woman found to be pregnant could face public flogging, fines, or being locked in stocks. Some were forced to wear signs around their necks reading "whore." Others were paraded through town holding dolls made of straw, visual shame, medieval style. You take one last look at the bed. The sheets are still untouched, silent, waiting. Somewhere, a door creaks open and a soft wind rushes through the hall. The matron is gone now, but her chair still rocks gently. You wonder how many verdicts were passed in this room. How many reputations rose and fell on the chance of a stain. Because in the medieval world, virginity wasn't just a concept, it was evidence. And sometimes, all it took was one red thread to determine a life's worth. You slip out of that suffocating bedroom of suspicion and into the twisted, spicy-smelling corridors of medieval curiosity, where the line between love and sorcery is smeared with herbs, powders, and a touch of powdered mummified toad. Tonight, you've stumbled into the bubbling, unsettling world of love potions, magical aphrodisiacs, and the slightly too eager neighborhood who claims she can make anyone fall for you, with a drop or two. The air here is thick with the scent of dried sage and something less identifiable, possibly cloves, possibly goat sweat. A heavy cauldron simmers over the fire, its contents turning a peculiar shade of gray-pink, like brain soup with aspirations. A woman in a dark dress hums softly, slicing herbs with a blade that looks both sacred and suspiciously stained. Yes, you've just entered a medieval love apothecary. And business is booming. Let's set the scene. In a time when most marriages were arranged and personal freedom was rare, people still, desperately, wanted control over their romantic fate. So they turned to magic. Or at least what passed for it. Witches, herbalists, and amateur alchemists became medieval matchmakers, offering concoctions that promised affection, attraction, or in some cases, total obsession. Historians still argue whether these potions actually worked or were more of a placebo, but when you're desperate and terrified of dying alone in a drafty stone house with 19 cats, you're willing to drink a little goat bile for the chance at a kiss. Some ingredients were tame: rose petals, cinnamon, wine. Others? Not so much. Think ground bat wings, powdered bones, menstrual blood, or the infamous witch's milk. Which wasn't actually milk, but a white secretion sometimes produced by swollen male nipples during hormonal imbalances. Yes, that was a real ingredient. Try ordering that at your local smoothie bar. One particularly odd and fringe tidbit: some love potions required the addition of earwax from a virgin, mixed with honey and whispering the name of your crush 3 times under a waxing moon. It's like astrology, but with more body fluid and fewer star charts. Not all the magic was ingested. Some spells were sewn into clothing, small sachets of herbs hidden in hems, meant to make the wearer irresistible. One noblewoman allegedly had her maid stitch dried beetles into the lining of her husband's doublet to stiffen his passion. It did something all right. He broke out in boils. The church, predictably, was not amused. Any form of love magic was seen as tampering with divine will, or worse, inviting demons. And if someone fell in love too quickly, too passionately, suspicions could be raised. In one Spanish village, a man was excommunicated after admitting he used a potion to make my betrothed love me more fiercely. The betrothed in question later claimed she simply had good taste. Of course, the world of magical seduction wasn't reserved for women. Men too sought ways to gain the upper hand, or the upper thigh. Some recipes were intended to increase virility, featuring ingredients like onions soaked in wine, roasted ants, or powdered stag horn. Others focused on domination, brews meant to subdue the will of a lover, often involving bodily fluids or bizarre rituals involving mirrors and hair clippings. One of the most infamous recipes came from a 14th century French grimoire. It called for 1 strand of the beloved's hair, a teaspoon of their saliva, preferably stolen during sleep, 3 drops of blood from the potion maker's thumb, and a boiled frog's heart, wrapped in linen and worn around the neck during moonrise. Modern dating apps seem tame in comparison, but magic didn't always involve potions. Sometimes it was words, whispered charms, sung verses, or written talismans, carried close to the heart or buried under the bed. In some villages, women would bake a man's name into a loaf of bread and eat it slowly at dawn while walking backward. Supposedly, it made him dream of you, or gave you indigestion. Results varied. And here's where things tipped from charming to chilling. When love spells didn't work, some desperate people moved on to curses. That's right. If you couldn't make someone love you, you could at least ensure no one else would. Medieval spite knew no bounds. In one preserved spellbook from Prague, a scorned woman describes burying a rooster's foot, a lock of her ex's hair, and a broken ring in a churchyard to curse his new lover with cold limbs and trembling passion. A poetic way of saying, "You'll never enjoy this." But not all magical matchmaking was so personal. Some apothecaries marketed general aphrodisiacs to the public, often disguised as medicinal tonics. These mixtures promised to heat the loins, rouse the marrow, or in one delightful case, awaken the serpent that sleeps between the thighs. Yes, that's a direct translation from a 13th century label. Did they work? Well, some probably did. Many included alcohol, hallucinogenic herbs, and natural stimulants like nutmeg or mandrake root. Mandrake in particular had a reputation for being wildly effective and extremely dangerous. Consuming too much could cause delirium, vomiting, or, according to one account, lustful dreams of beastly size. Speaking of mandrake, remember the old superstition? When you pulled it from the ground, it would scream. Totally untrue. But very fun to imagine when you realize some people believe the scream itself could be captured and distilled into an aphrodisiac, which is like bottling a horror movie and using it as cologne. By now, you're leaning closer to the cauldron, watching as steam rises and curls like ghostly fingers. The witch, not old, not young, leans in and whispers, "What is it you seek?" And for a second, you don't know if she's offering love or warning you away. Because in a world where hearts were traded like land deeds and passion was policed by religion, love potions offered a taste of control. A tiny vial of possibility. Risky, dangerous, sometimes absurd, but deeply human. You step back from the fire. The air tingles on your skin, and somewhere in your pocket, you swear you feel something warm. Was it the potion? The heat? Or just a really strong cinnamon stick? Either way, as you step back into the cool night air, you can't help but wonder, in a world that feared desire, maybe magic wasn't just a tool. Maybe it was a rebellion in disguise. The scent of herbs and mandrake smoke still clings to your cloak as you wander deeper into the city, until suddenly, it's replaced by something warmer, wetter. Steam rises from tiled windows, water trickles down stone gutters, and laughter, real, relaxed, and unmistakably flirty, bubbles through the fog. You're now entering one of the most accidentally erotic corners of medieval life, the public bathhouse. Your boots squelch slightly on damp stones as you step inside. The air is thick with humidity, infused with lavender oil and whatever passed for soap back then, usually animal fat, ash, and crushed flowers. Candles flicker against mosaic-tiled walls. And through the mist, shadows move. Bare shoulders, twinkling jewelry, the occasional hairy ankle. You get the picture. Bathhouses were supposed to be hygienic, and yes, to be fair, they were. Sort of. People came to scrub off the grime of cobbled streets and soot-choked chimneys. But if you thought it ended there, you're in for a surprise. These watery spaces weren't just for cleansing, they were hotspots of gossip, courtship, and temptation, all hidden behind polite splashes and linen towels. In the late Middle Ages, especially in cities like Paris, Prague, and Nuremberg, bathhouses, known as stews, became social centers. Picture it, rich and poor mingling in warm water, sipping spiced wine, listening to musicians play lute covers of questionable ballads. Some even had menus offering not just food and drink, but services. You glance up. That's not just a shampoo menu. That's a euphemism list in 5 languages. Historians still argue whether every bathhouse doubled as a brothel. Many didn't, but some? Absolutely. A respectable establishment might feature separate male and female hours, hired scrubbers, and a strict no-touching policy. Others encouraged the touching, heavily. One bathhouse in Lübeck reportedly offered shared tubs and linen sheets freshly boiled, the medieval equivalent of a VIP package. And while nobles had their own private baths, many of them still frequented the stews for the thrill of mingling. It was a place to see and be seen, just without the armor. Let's take a detour into fashion. In the bathhouse, clothing became symbolic. A bare shoulder might be innocent or an invitation. A towel worn low signaled availability. A linen wrap dyed blue? That's not just a style choice. It meant the wearer was a professional bather, a category that hovered awkwardly between servant, masseuse, and courtesan. Some fringe tales speak of bathhouses where guests wore nothing but masks. Yes, a full-on masquerade waist-deep in water. Whether it's true or a particularly vivid fantasy of a monk with a good memory and a bad conscience, no one knows. But admit it, you're picturing it now. One documented custom in Bohemia involved couples entering baths together before marriage, supervised by elders. To learn one another's scent, the record says. Not romantic exactly, but memorable. And possibly very awkward if someone forgot to bathe that day. Of course, not everyone approved. The church waged constant war against public bathing. Why? Because when people get naked together, things tend to escalate. Officials complained that stews encouraged lust, vanity, and immodesty. One bishop in England even called them gateways to Satan's hallway, which is a pretty cool band name if nothing else. Some cities enforced separate entrances for men and women. Others required windows to remain open for transparency. Still, temptation seeped in like steam. You can't hide sensuality in a room full of warm water and bored nobles. But here's the thing. Bathhouses weren't just scandalous, they were also equalizing. For a brief, sweaty moment, rich and poor, noble and merchant, scholar and smith, all sat shoulder to shoulder in shared water. Class blurred, skin wrinkled, secrets floated like flower petals. One traveler wrote that he heard more rumors in a single stew than a month at court. Now let's talk accessories. People brought their own bath kits, scrapers, oils, even decorative sponges. One nobleman allegedly had his initials embroidered onto a sea sponge. Bull. There were also bath rings, small floating trays that held wine, dried fruit, or conversation dice. Nothing says romance like flirting over a bobbing plate of raisins. You pass through a steam curtain and arrive in a smaller chamber, private, dimly lit, with a large tub built into the ground. Candles flicker above. 2 people whisper to each other in a language you can't quite catch. One reaches for the other's hand. There's a pause, then laughter. It's not dramatic. It's not sinful. It's just human. Quirkier still? In some parts of Germany, bathhouses offered post-bath performances. Small theater acts performed in the stews. Imagine a guy in soggy tights reciting Chaucer waist-deep in soap bubbles. You came for the cleansing, you stayed for the iambic pentameter. And yet, these spaces were also fragile. When the Black Death hit, many bathhouses shut down. Too much touching, too much water. People feared infection not just from disease but from sin. Steam turned from soothing to suspicious. Some bathers were accused of using the hot water to soften minds and morals. That's a poetic way of saying things got frisky. Still, even as society cracked down, the memory lingered. Art from the era often depicts bath scenes with couples lounging, chatting, touching, and sipping wine. It's not the shameful stuff of sermons, it's cozy, calm, and yes, occasionally scandalous. You run your fingers along the edge of the tub now. The stone is smooth, worn by decades of secret meetings, whispered gossip, and lingering touches. There's a damp towel on a hook, a cup half full of wine, the ghost of a laugh somewhere in the corner. In a world obsessed with rules and restraint, the bathhouse was a loophole. A place where bodies were bared, but sometimes so were hearts. Maybe not every tryst ended in love, but for a few quiet, steamy minutes it didn't matter. The warmth of the bathhouse still clings to your skin as you step into cooler night air, your thoughts still steeped in steam and secret glances. But your journey doesn't slow. No, because down a crooked lane, past a tavern door creaking on rusty hinges, something stranger awaits. You push open the warped wood and step into a dim room that hums, not with music but with belief. You've just entered the world of sex, magic, and fertility rites, where body and spell entwine like ivy on a crumbling stone wall. The tavern is half full but quiet. A circle has formed near the hearth, where someone chants low in Latin, or what they think is Latin. A small bowl smokes with burning herbs. A woman in red tosses in a strand of hair. Then she whispers a name. In the medieval mindset, the physical and spiritual worlds weren't separate. They overlapped, tangled, bled into each other like ink on damp parchment. So it made sense, at least to them, that sex wasn't just about desire, it could summon, protect, or punish. And when your survival depends on harvests, heirs, and hexes, you get creative. In certain parts of rural France and Germany, seasonal festivals, like Beltane or Midsummer, were laced with fertility rituals. Couples were encouraged to sleep outdoors on those nights, not just for fun but to bless the fields. No, really. The belief was that coupling under starlight infused the land with vitality. You laugh, but some of those fields did get excellent yields. Even more curious were the charms. Amulets carved from animal bone, worn around the neck, were believed to enhance virility. One popular charm was a carved phallus on a string, basically a medieval lucky rabbit's foot, but, well, more specific. Archaeologists still find these, tucked in the lining of belts, buried near thresholds, or hidden beneath marriage beds. But perhaps the strangest practices emerged in the realm of sympathetic magic, where, like attracts like. Want someone to fall in love with you? Slip a piece of your clothing into their food. Want them to lust after you? Bake bread with your sweat. Yes, your sweat. Preferably collected from the inner thigh. Historians still argue whether people truly practiced this or whether it was slander invented by suspicious clergy, but references appear often enough to raise eyebrows. And then there were the love potions. The ingredients? Let's just say, they'd never pass modern health codes. Powdered toad bone, menstrual blood, grave dirt, and sometimes urine. All mixed with wine, honey, or goat's milk. Not exactly a romantic cocktail. Still, desperate hearts do desperate things. If your beloved started acting strange, sleeping too well, or talking to flowers, it wasn't madness, it was probably magic. You spot a woman in the corner now, wearing a green sash and humming. She stirs something in a clay cup. The man beside her smiles nervously. Maybe he knows, or maybe he doesn't, that her potion contains saffron, rose petals, and a shaved fingernail. Supposedly, if he dreams of her tonight, the spell worked. In southern Italy, stories emerged of witches who could ensnare men with a touch. They were accused of using Venus oil, a sensual blend made from herbs, resin, and, get this, bat wings. Again, possibly slander, or possibly a very dramatic form of aromatherapy. One mainstream fact often overlooked is that midwives, the most trusted female healers, were frequently consulted for both conception and contraception. Yes, contraception. Despite popular belief, medieval people did try to control reproduction. Recipes survive for mixtures made of pomegranate rind, pennyroyal, or crushed ants. Whether they worked is debatable, but the intent was very real. In one 12th century manual from the Middle East, translated into Latin and passed across Europe, a formula appears involving wild lettuce, wool soaked in red wine, and specific prayers whispered 3 times. You get the feeling it wasn't exactly foolproof, but neither is modern dating. And speaking of wool, there's evidence that wool plugs soaked in wine or oil were used as a kind of medieval sponge, a contraceptive barrier. You wince at the thought, but hey, they were trying. Still, not every magic was consensual. Some dark corners of history speak of binding spells, rituals meant to control a lover's desire, or worse, deny it. One unsettling tale from Bavaria involves a woman who tied knots in cords while naming parts of her husband's body, locking his urges away unless she released them. The cords were hidden in the rafters, beside dried herbs and a tiny carved figurine that looked suspiciously like her husband. Scholars still debate the line between folklore and reality in these stories. Did people actually believe these spells worked? Or were they metaphors, coping mechanisms, or exaggerated warnings passed down through hushed gossip? But belief has power, even if the ingredients are questionable. You sit now near the hearth, watching as another woman drops lavender and mugwort into a flame. The smoke coils upward, catching the candlelight. She hums softly. No demons here, just longing, loneliness, and hope. All the things magic has ever tried to solve. One fringe detail. In some regions, infertile couples were advised to copulate on graves. The idea was that death would lend its dormant power to birth. Disturbing? Yes. But understandable in a world where infant mortality was high, and each birth was both miracle and gamble. You wonder how many of these rituals were done in secret. How many candles were lit in barns? How many whispers rose under moonlight? Not wicked, not perverse, just deeply human. Because when medicine fails and prayer is silent, magic becomes a last embrace. The tavern quiets now. The spell is done. The names have been spoken. Somewhere out in the dark, a heart skips or a seed stirs. Or maybe not. But in this age of saints and superstition, of relics and herbs, no one really knows where mystery ends and miracle begins. You rise from your seat, the scent of time clinging to your sleeve. The door creaks open again. And outside, the night feels charged as though the air itself has been whispered into. You walk onward, past the spell-sweet tavern and down a moonlit path where hedges loom like watchful spirits. But something shifted in the night. The air feels thicker, the shadows more deliberate. A different sort of secrecy surrounds you now, less mystical, more medical. You've stumbled into the world of medical misconceptions and bizarre prescriptions, where medieval doctors tried to tame desire with leeches, urine charts, and some rather unfortunate poultices. A wooden door creaks open to reveal a healer's chamber. The room smells like vinegar and damp parchment. Bundles of dried herbs hang low from beams. A man sits on a stool, scribbling notes beside a woman who's clearly uncomfortable. He asks her without irony what her dreams have smelled like lately. You've arrived at the crossroads of sex and science, medieval edition. Let's be clear, medieval medicine wasn't entirely guesswork. The four-humor system was the backbone of medical understanding across Europe. Your body, they believed, was governed by blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Desire? A side effect of imbalance. Too much blood made you lustful, too much yellow bile made you irritable. You right now? Probably a touch phlegmatic, contemplative, and damp. Doctors treated excess desire, especially in women, with a range of colorful cures. Some advised regular bleeding, yes, bloodletting, as a way to cool the passions. Others recommended cold baths, strict diets, or wearing amulets made from hematite and coral. One text suggests binding lettuce leaves to the genitals to quell unnatural heat. No comment. Historians still argue whether some of these methods were ever widely practiced or were just theoretical, designed more to sound impressive than actually help. But the manuscripts survive, their margins crowded with confused notes and occasional very judgmental doodles. You pause beside a shelf lined with jars. One contains powdered deer antler, believed to ignite male potency. Another is filled with goose fat, used in what can only be described as a medieval version of personal lubricant. You look away quickly. Too late. Here's a real kicker. Medical texts like the Trotula, a 12th century gynecological compendium, advised that women with unquiet wombs should sniff burnt herbs while placing warm stones on their abdomen. One particularly bizarre remedy included inserting ground pearls mixed with honey. Sparkly yes, safe no. Meanwhile, male issues were no less awkward. Impotence was often seen as a spiritual failing, but physicians blamed poor diet, overwork, or even demon possession. One cure involved wearing a rooster heart in a leather pouch sewn inside your tunic, right next to your real heart, as if proximity might inspire performance. In England, some healers insisted that men bathe their genitals in cold wine daily to stay virile but not frenzied. There's also a report of monks advising salted frog broth for dampening the loins. You really hope that was just a metaphor. But medieval medicine wasn't just gross, it was intimate. Without anesthesia, without privacy, and often without much consent, examinations could be traumatic. Midwives and barber surgeons were often the ones tasked with treating sexual issues, and their knowledge ranged from brilliant herbalism to outright myth. And yet, these same practitioners delivered babies, healed infections, and whispered truths about bodies that the church refused to acknowledge. In places where priests shamed, midwives soothed. And in between leeches and lie, they offered comfort in a world that made desire a diagnosis. One fringe case, found in a 15th century Polish manuscript, involves a woman who claimed her husband had been cursed with an invisible member. He could feel it, she said, but she could not. The village healer diagnosed it as phantom virility and prescribed blessed salt, nettle juice, and for some reason, a goat's ear. Historians still debate whether this was a real belief or the world's oldest "it's not me, it's you" scenario. Even urine got involved. Physicians would inspect its color and scent to determine one's state of health, including whether a person was suffering from excessive longing. Milky urine meant desire. Reddish-brown meant anger. You glance at a dusty chart nailed to the wall, its little jars painted in watercolor hues. Romantic? Not exactly, but oddly thorough. And sometimes the cure was worse than the ailment. For wandering womb syndrome, where it was believed the uterus could travel around the body like a lost dog, doctors recommended coaxing it back into place with scented oils near the vagina while waving foul smells at the nose to drive it downward. It's not science, it's scent-based navigation. The church, of course, didn't like this mixing of the carnal and the clinical. Too much talk of bodies, especially women's bodies, was considered suspect. Many female healers were accused of witchcraft. Even when their remedies worked, their popularity could get them hanged. And yet, people kept coming. For better or worse, the village healer's door was never quiet. You picture a woman gripping the edges of a wooden table, sweat dotting her brow, as someone applies a poultice to her belly and chants a rhyme to quiet her womb. Is it superstition? Or the only hope she has? As you leave the chamber, the scent of mint and vinegar still lingers in your nostrils. You realize now that medicine, magic, and morality were never really separate in the medieval world. They overlapped like bad dreams and herbal tea, equal parts healing and harm. Out in the cool night again, you feel the quiet thrum of your own pulse, steady but ancient. Desire might be dangerous, but so is the cure. You follow the narrow trail until the trees part suddenly, revealing a crumbling stone building nestled in the woods. Ivy coils up the pillars. Birds hush as you step inside. You're standing in a monastic cloister, a place where silence was sacred, chastity was law, and temptation was always nearby. Tonight, you're slipping behind monastery walls to witness what happened when vows of celibacy clashed with very human cravings. You pass under an archway carved with faded Latin. A monk kneels near a fountain, murmuring a prayer with such intensity you'd think he was warding off the devil himself. And in a way he probably is. Because for monks and nuns, sexuality wasn't just forbidden, it was the battlefield of their souls. Every glance, every touch, every impure dream was seen as a spiritual ambush. Celibacy was considered the gold standard of holiness. The church taught that abstaining from sex brought you closer to God, that resisting temptation purified your soul like fire tempers metal. But behind closed doors, things weren't always so pure. Historians still argue whether celibacy was consistently enforced or widely ignored, especially in isolated communities. But reports and punishments abound. Monks caught in compromising positions were sometimes whipped, excommunicated, or transferred to remote outposts. Some were forced to walk naked through town. One poor soul was sewn into a leather sack with a live dog and tossed into the river. Extreme? Absolutely. But the church took these things seriously. You pass rows of simple beds, each separated by a thin curtain. These aren't rooms, just sleeping nooks. Privacy? None. And yet, even here, temptation crept in. Some monks confessed to nocturnal visitations, a polite term for erotic dreams. Others blamed succubi, female demons said to seduce sleeping men. One monk in 13th century England swore a succubus appeared every Thursday. You suspect he just had a thing for routine. Then there were the nuns. Women who gave up the world for a life of prayer, and yet were not immune to longing. A letter from a 14th century abbess in northern France pleads for guidance after discovering two of her sisters kissing behind the chapel. Her solution? Locking them in separate rooms and prescribing more fasting. Because nothing says cool down like boiled turnips and solitude. But some scandals were bigger. Much bigger. In Italy, a convent was found to have secret passageways connecting it to a nearby monastery. The two communities were caught holding midnight rendezvous that included wine, dancing, and, well, things not approved by Rome. When questioned, one nun simply replied, "The Lord understands our loneliness." You almost admire her honesty. Church leaders tried to stem the tide. Warnings were painted above doors, "Guard thy thoughts." Some monasteries even chained monks to their beds at night. Others required cold showers or icy foot baths before sleep. Self-flagellation, whipping oneself to resist desire, became a sort of spiritual hack. But scholars debate whether it was more about guilt or control. And still the urges leaked through. Confessional records, meticulously written in Latin to soften the shame, tell of monks visiting brothels in disguise, of nuns hiding lovers in baskets meant for bread. One woman was caught smuggling her boyfriend into the cloister inside a wine barrel. If that's not commitment, what is? You find a tiny side room, lit by a single candle. This is the scriptorium, where monks spent hours copying holy texts. But what's this? Scribbled in the margins of a psalm is a doodle, two figures tangled together with the words Deus ignas mihi, God forgive me. It's subtle, but it speaks volumes. Not all breaches were physical. Emotional intimacy too was seen as risky. Particular friendships, deep bonds between two monks or nuns, were discouraged as they could lead to jealousy, distraction, or worse. Letters were censored. Eye contact during prayers was monitored. A 15th century rulebook even warned against speaking too sweetly. Fringe communities sometimes pushed back. The Beguines, for instance, lay religious women who lived together but didn't take permanent vows, formed intense female bonds, sometimes romantic, often spiritual. Church leaders didn't know what to do with them. Were they saints? Heretics? Lonely women with too much autonomy? And then there's the case of Brother Albrecht, a German monk who wrote erotic poetry in secret. His verses, hidden behind a loose brick, described longing not just for a woman, but for the softness of touch, the scent of hair, the ache of restraint. When discovered, his writings were burned, and he was sent to live in silence for the rest of his life. The brick remains. You hear a bell toll in the distance, vespers, evening prayers. The sound echoes through the cloister, solemn and heavy. You imagine the monks kneeling again, eyes closed, hearts divided. They want salvation, but they also want other things. And isn't that the real story here? The tension between the divine and the carnal, the rules and the rebellion. These weren't wicked people, just people, trying to live up to impossible expectations in a world where even dreams were policed. You step outside again. The night feels cooler, the stars sharper. Behind you, the cloister stands firm, its stones soaked with secrets. You wonder how many prayers were whispered not out of devotion but desperation, and how many of those were answered. The gravel crunches softly beneath your feet as you leave the cloister's shadow and re-enter the folds of the town. But things feel different now. The air buzzes not with holiness or whispers, but with movement, purposeful, economic, and unmistakably transactional. You've wandered into the world of medieval sex work, where brothels were state-sanctioned, morality was flexible, and society both condemned and depended on the women behind the red shutters. The first thing you notice is the smell: incense, sweat, and something sweet. Candied figs, maybe. A barker leans in a doorway, calling out specials like it's market day. 2 songs and a story for a smile, he hollers. You try not to meet his eye. This isn't your usual bedtime stroll. Unlike modern assumptions, medieval sex work was often regulated rather than hidden. Many towns in Europe, particularly in France, Italy, and the Low Countries, had legal brothels run by municipalities. Some were attached to taverns. Others operated out of multi-room buildings with strict curfews and mandatory bath days. Because nothing ruins a good scandal like poor hygiene. In places like Avignon or Dijon, these houses were taxed, supervised, and required to post operating hours, like libraries, only louder. The women, called bordeliers, were licensed, given health checks or something vaguely resembling one, and required to wear certain colors: yellow veils, striped hoods, or bells on their ankles. Charming, right? Historians still argue whether this regulation was meant to protect the women or just control them. Probably both. Authorities didn't mind sex work as long as it stayed in designated areas, didn't involve married men, and crucially profited the town. Priorities. Some women entered willingly, seeking income, protection, or a kind of freedom. Others were coerced or trafficked or trapped by debt. One record from 14th century London tells of a girl who worked off her father's gambling debts by joining a brothel at 15. Her name was Margaret. She eventually bought her freedom and opened a bakery. You hope the bread was amazing. There were rules, of course. Some brothels barred repeat customers. Others allowed one-night love poems but forbade personal gifts. And while religious orders often condemned sex workers, they also accepted their donations. There's a receipt from 1378 where a nun gratefully acknowledges a generous tithe from a known courtesan. God moves in mysterious ways. You step inside one of these houses now, not as a customer, don't worry, but as an observer. The parlor is busy. Laughter swirls with lute music. The women here aren't meek or mysterious. They're sharp-eyed, confident, managing their clients in the room like seasoned performers. One flips a coin mid-conversation, never breaking eye contact. You suspect she knows exactly how this night will end, for everyone in it. On the fringe of this industry were the high-class courtesans, especially in Venice and Florence. These women weren't just lovers. They were educated, fluent in politics and poetry, and often entertained nobles and scholars. Some even had contracts with patrons, including wardrobes, housing, and annual stipends. Not bad for someone without virtue, as the church liked to say. Take Veronica Franco, a Venetian courtesan who lived later in the Renaissance but emerged from this very medieval tradition. She wrote poetry, debated in salons, and schooled senators in both love and literature. Her letters survive, full of wit and fury. One ends with, "If I cannot be saintly, I shall be unforgettable." A tagline if we ever heard one. Still, even glamour had a price. Public shaming was a constant threat. Women caught entertaining men outside licensed zones could be paraded naked through the streets or have their hair forcibly shaved. Some were branded, others exiled. Yet they kept coming, because cities thrived on what they publicly scorned. Brothels even served state functions. During festivals, towns would offer free entry as a way to distract drunk crowds. One German duke famously funded a new hospital wing with brothel taxes and publicly thanked the ladies of the Silk Road in a speech. You wish you'd seen the reaction. And yet, within these painted walls, there were moments of real humanity. Friendships formed. Jokes were shared. One diary fragment describes a group of women pooling money to help a friend escape a violent client. Another speaks of secret songbooks passed between girls who'd never learned to read but knew the lyrics by heart. You hear one such tune now, soft, rhythmic, a lullaby repurposed into something bawdier. It loops over a simple lute melody and floats out the open window, toward a street that never really sleeps. The church, for its part, waged a confusing battle. St. Augustine claimed that without sex workers, lust would overthrow society. Thomas Aquinas reluctantly agreed, calling brothels a necessary evil. But public sermons still condemned the women as fallen, broken, in need of saving or silencing. Many were forced into penitent houses, where they lived under nuns' supervision until they reformed. Few did. Fewer wanted to. The real cruelty wasn't the work itself, but how society flipped the script. Clients walked away clean. Women stayed stained, their names whispered even decades later. One court record in Bruges includes a man confessing he'd known a woman in his youth, only to have her fined retroactively. She was 87. Justice medieval style. And yet, in all this mess they endured. Painted lips, careful laughter, coded glances. They built a world that knew how to survive. Not through softness but strategy. Not through innocence but ingenuity. You step back outside as the lute fades and the door closes behind you. The street is quieter now, the moon just brushing the eaves of nearby houses. Maybe one of those windows belonged to a woman who sang for silver and dreamed in gold. And as you walk on, you carry her voice with you. The road bends again and you're guided not by torchlight or song this time, but by something stranger, laughter. Low, irregular, almost giddy. You pause at the entrance of a crowded courtyard. There's a smell of wine, damp wool, and spice. And a sign above the arch, painted with a grinning gesture, "Carnival tonight." Welcome to the world of seasonal release rituals, where once or twice a year, the rules snapped like brittle twigs, and what followed was a dizzying blend of chaos, confetti, and highly questionable morality. Medieval Europe didn't often encourage people to let loose, but when it did, it went all in. You push through the crowd. It's a riot of masks, painted faces, gender-swapped outfits, and wild dancing. A priest stumbles by with a crown of sausages. Someone dressed as a nun lifts her skirts to reveal muddy boots and a flask. Somewhere a pig squeals, not in fear, just festive confusion. This isn't sacrilege. Not entirely. It's carnival or fastnacht or Shrovetide, depending on where you are. A sanctioned season of inversion, often held just before Lent, the somber 40 days of fasting and self-denial. This was society's pressure valve. A moment to flip the hierarchy, mock authority, and indulge in all the things you were normally told to fear. Historians still argue whether these festivals were true liberation or just a controlled outlet, a brief pause before returning to rigid norms. But for you, standing here among the feathers and flower, it feels real, raw, and deeply bizarre. One of the strangest features? Public symbolic sex acts. These weren't necessarily explicit, but they were definitely not subtle. Parades featured giant phallic bread loaves. Young men chased women through the streets with hobby horses shaped like, well, you get the idea. Some towns staged marriage trials, where people were randomly paired for mock weddings, and sometimes real betting. In southern France, villagers would build a fertility tree covered in ribbons, sausages, and apples. Newlyweds danced around it. Then someone, always someone, got drunk and climbed it naked. Tradition apparently. And in parts of Germany, people held cock-throwing contests. Yes, involving live roosters and, bizarrely, courtship metaphors. The winner would sometimes be allowed to choose a bride for the night. Not a real one. Just one night, one laugh, one blur. Inversion wasn't limited to lovers. Servants became lords. Children mocked their teachers. A boy bishop might be elected to lead mock prayers while actual clergy danced behind him. It was chaos. Sacred chaos. One Flemish festival crowned a lord of misrule, a peasant given full symbolic control over the town for a day. He issued absurd laws: all pigs shall wear hats, and ordered townsfolk to kiss strangers or trade clothes. One year, he demanded that all public benches be turned backwards. No one sat for a week, but the real fire came at night. You follow a trail of candles toward a hilltop where a wedding is taking place. The bride wears a burlap sack. The groom has antlers. Around them, villagers chant rhymes that sound suspiciously like innuendos. A man with a wooden mask passes you a cup. You sip. It's mead, heavily spiced, probably with something you don't want to ask about. Then comes the bedding rite. Not real, they insist, just symbolic. The crowd lifts the couple onto a straw pallet, covers them with blankets, and sings lewd lullabies while shaking tambourines. Everyone laughs. No one watches too closely. The line between mockery and desire blurs here, like steam over a winter field. In some parts of Europe, actual temporary marriages were permitted during this period. Young people were wed for a night or two, ostensibly for fun but often with real consequences. A woman in 14th century Cologne gave birth 9 months after Carnival and insisted it was a festival blessing. The father denied everything. The town fined them both and threw the baby a party. You honestly don't know who came out ahead. And then there's the masks. Masks gave people license to flirt, to jeer, to steal kisses and identities alike. One masked woman in Venice danced with 8 different suitors in one night, one of whom turned out to be her husband. He didn't recognize her. She didn't correct him. Historians still argue whether she was punishing him or just curious. Church authorities grumbled, of course. They called Carnival the Devil's Sabbath. But they rarely banned it outright. Because every community knew, better a little madness now than a riot later. And besides, even priests needed to laugh. There were limits though. In Prague, one festival got so out of hand, 3 weddings, 2 fistfights, and 1 accidental goat sacrifice, that authorities shut it down for a decade. The goat, it said, was canonized in local folklore. But Carnival wasn't all giggles and gigolos. For the poor, it was a rare shot at joy. For the young, a taste of freedom. And for the lonely, maybe even a touch of something more. A woman in Bruges wrote a poem about a masked dancer who kissed her hand during Fastnacht and never returned. She called him her phantom husband. You can't tell if she's bitter or still smiling. You stand at the edge of the square now, the celebration behind you still pulsing like a drumbeat. The moon hangs high. Somewhere, someone is telling a joke that only makes sense after 4 cups of cider and a stolen kiss. And somewhere else, a married couple pretends not to recognize each other, for one night at least. Because sometimes the most bizarre thing isn't what people do in secret, but what they're allowed to do when the rules take a holiday. You leave the echoes of Carnival behind, brushing crumbs from your tunic and wondering if that last mug of mead was a mistake. The path narrows again, quieter now, more thoughtful. As you walk, you notice a curious symbol scratched into a tree trunk, 2 intertwined serpents circled by tiny runes. A breeze picks up, cool and oddly fragrant. And suddenly you're in the woods again, but not alone. There's a ring of standing stones ahead, cloaked in moss and moonlight. Tonight, you've wandered into the shadowy realm of ritual magic, love spells, and aphrodisiacs. The mysterious underbelly of medieval intimacy, where potions were brewed with hope, desperation, and sometimes bat wings. In a time when love was often arranged, sex was tightly regulated, and romantic freedom was a luxury few could afford, the promise of supernatural aid was hard to resist. And so, people turned to folk healers, cunning women, and herbalists. Those half-feared, half-revered figures who knew how to stir more than just soup. You crouch near a stone where someone's left offerings. Bundles of rosemary, bits of cloth, a wax heart stabbed with pins. Romantic? Not quite. This was the medieval version of "he's just not that into you," but make it witchy. One of the most common magical requests? To make someone fall in love with you, or at least want you back. Recipes for love potions were passed down in whispers. A typical brew might include red wine, dried rose petals, and powdered mandrake root. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it caused diarrhea. The line was thin. In Italy, women wore small bags of sympathetic herbs near their breasts, lavender, vervain, or basil, to radiate affection. In France, a jealous lover might mix his own blood with honey and serve it in tea. If that feels extreme, remember, this was a world without dating apps. You improvised. Historians still argue whether these practices were seen as real magic or symbolic acts. But regardless of belief, they were widespread. Church authorities condemned them, labeling them as demonic manipulations. But people kept whispering, kept mixing. You examine a small parchment pinned to a tree, written in shaky Latin. It's a charm to increase virility. The instructions are clear. Find a hare's kidney, soak it in vinegar, recite a specific psalm backwards, and, well, apply liberally. You're not sure how liberally, but it smells like desperation. And then there were the aphrodisiacs. Some were perfectly reasonable, spices like cinnamon, saffron, and ginger. Others? Not so much. Dried lizard powder, crushed pearls, the fat of a freshly killed goose. A 14th century German remedy prescribed snail slime mixed with fig milk for stirring the passions. Modern medicine disagrees. In England, a common trick was to sew a bit of dried mint and clover into the hem of your crush's cloak, ensuring they'd dream of your mouth. One particularly bold suitor snuck a love charm into a knight's saddle. The knight did in fact dream about him for weeks. Then he ordered the man flogged. So, mixed results. Sex magic wasn't just about seduction. Some rituals aimed to enhance performance, ensure fertility, or curse a rival's potency. In Hungary, women reportedly buried rotten eggs near their ex-lover's door to wilt his desire. You hope it was just the smell doing the wilting. And for those who couldn't afford rare ingredients, there was always sympathetic magic, where one item stands in for another. A strand of hair, a footprint in the snow, even a favorite glove could be enchanted, kissed, burned, or buried beneath a specific tree during a full moon. Did it work? Maybe not. But it gave people agency, a flicker of control in a world ruled by class, custom, and chance. Of course, not everyone approved. Clergy denounced these practices as dangerous. In sermons, they warned that invoking love through magic was binding the will, akin to spiritual kidnapping. And sometimes they were right to be concerned. One documented case in Denmark involved a woman poisoning her husband's tea with a love tonic. He grew obsessed with the neighbor's cow. Scholars aren't sure if it was the potion or something deeper. Punishments for magic varied. Some charm makers were whipped or imprisoned. Others, especially women, were accused of witchcraft. Yet many communities turned a blind eye, especially when things got results. After all, who wouldn't want a bit of help when your marriage is arranged and your crush is a knight who's never made eye contact? In more remote villages, fertility rituals blurred the line between faith and folklore. In Brittany, couples who struggled to conceive might visit a sacred spring, drink from a horn-shaped cup, then leave behind an offering of lace or hair. One tradition involved sitting naked on a sacred rock while reciting a charm about unbinding the womb. You imagine the drafts were invigorating. And let's not forget the dream stones, smooth pebbles placed under your pillow to reveal your future lover in a vision. One particularly dramatic guidebook warns, if your dream ends in fire, beware. He is already pledged to another. Sounds like medieval Tinder with extra trauma. You pause beside a hollow log. Inside is a bundle of herbs tied with red thread, likely left by someone hopeful or heartbroken. It's oddly touching, because for all the batwings and wild rituals, the underlying desire remains painfully human, to be seen, to be wanted, to matter to someone else. And isn't that the heart of it? These weren't just superstitions. They were attempts to grasp the slippery mystery of connection. In a world full of arranged unions and silenced feelings, love magic was a rebellion of longing. The forest begins to thin. You walk on, carrying the faint scent of dried thyme and wood smoke. The stones behind you shimmer briefly in the moonlight, then vanish into shadow. And maybe, just maybe, you feel a warm pulse at your wrist, where a single clover strand now rests. You step out of the forest just as dawn threatens the edges of the sky with pale blue. The path becomes rough again, worn by years and carved with deep, uneven grooves. But something's different here. You hear the slow creak of leather straps, the metallic jingle of a chain, and the distant sound of breath held too tightly. You've arrived at the most unexpected doorway yet, the noble court where chivalry lived, but so did kink. Forget what you know about the clean-cut knights of bedtime stories. Under all that polished armor and polite poetry was a world of roleplay, punishment, and ritualized submission that would make even your local dungeon club blush. Because in the courts of medieval Europe, sex wasn't just a private act. It was a performance and sometimes an elaborate power game. And the leading roles? Knights and their ladies. Not married couples, usually. This was courtly love, the very specific, very dramatic emotional code that paired chivalrous men with unattainable women. And part of the thrill? The inequality, the longing, the suffering. Your entire job as a knight might be to pine for your lord's wife and write terrible poetry about how her ankles ruined your sleep schedule. Historians still argue whether courtly love was ever truly acted upon or just a literary fantasy. But the artifacts we have, letters, poems, secret diaries, suggest that at least some people were living the dream. And what a bizarre dream it was. A knight might wear his lady's undergarments, yes really, inside his armor during battle as a token. Some tied a single strand of her hair to their sword hilt for blessing. One account tells of a squire who carried his mistress's used linen glove in his mouth for a full tournament. You gag a little just imagining it, but it wasn't all soft sighs and heavy glances. Some noble women embraced dominance rituals, where their knight had to complete humiliating tasks to prove his devotion, like kissing her slippers in front of the court, or spending an entire feast chained to her chair like a pet hound. There are even records of a 13th century Bavarian noblewoman who made her lover bark like a dog before granting him a single touch of her finger. It's weirdly empowering. Also a little itchy. Power, in fact, was the undercurrent of these performances. The knight offered service, the lady wielded control. And sometimes that meant very literal submission, being struck with a riding crop, crawling across the floor, or publicly declaring, "I am not worthy of your gaze." All in full view of everyone at the banquet. Don't worry, this wasn't always serious. Medieval nobles loved play acting. Mock trials were popular, where a knight was accused of failing in love. The sentence might include singing humiliating songs or dressing in women's clothes. In one particularly scandalous case, a nobleman had to wear a bell on his codpiece for an entire week after failing to complete a challenge of love. The sound apparently gave him away during every sneaky moment. And if you're thinking, this all feels a bit theatrical, you're absolutely right. The medieval court was basically a traveling drama club with a kink twist. Banquets would feature erotic riddles, joke contracts of loyalty, and invented titles like Mistress of Heartbreak or Lord of Longing. One French noble actually handed out certificates for most enduring suffering in silence. You probably win one too. But let's not forget that some of this wasn't just for fun. In arranged marriages, where affection was rare and pleasure even rarer, these roleplays offered a sense of emotional autonomy, a space where people could explore desire outside of rigid norms. One record describes a couple who pretended to be servant and master for months, only later admitting they were married the whole time. And then there's the poetry. So much poetry. Entire manuscripts survive, full of verses about bondage, longing, denial, and metaphorical submission. One particularly dramatic poem begins, "She held the leash of my desire, and I crawled gladly through her thorns." Bull. A little itchy. Very on brand. You reach a small garden now, walled with carved stone. In the center is a marble bench where nobles once whispered behind fans and goblets. Here, someone left behind a velvet mask, tied with golden ribbon, abandoned but still warm from a recent wearer. You can almost hear the giggles, the staged outrage, the whispered, "Meet me in the rose arbor. Bring the cuffs." Not all roleplay was heterosexual either. In certain courts, especially in southern France, stories emerge of male companions who styled their friendships in the same knight-lady dynamic. They exchanged secret tokens, staged elaborate games of pursuit and capture, and sometimes, something more. The records fade quickly, sometimes redacted, sometimes lost accidentally in fire. But the suggestion lingers. Were these practices common? No. But among the elite, who had the luxury of boredom and the means to stage fantasy, kinky courtly rituals flourished quietly. And they weren't always hidden. In some feasts, people openly performed their playful submission. A nobleman from Navarre once arrived to a banquet on a chain, led by a woman dressed as the goddess Venus. Her comment? "He knows how to follow instructions." You sit for a moment on the edge of the bench. The stone is cool, the night settling in again. You can still hear faint laughter in the air, echoes of a world where hierarchy, affection, and erotic performance all blurred together into something strange, stylized, and deeply human. Because behind all the velvet and vows, you realize this was about power and trust, attention and risk. Just like the herbs, the rituals, and the dreams, a reminder that even in a world of steel and scripture, people still long to play, to perform, to pretend. You step through the last of the gardens, leaves crunching faintly underfoot as the noble courts fall behind you. Now the landscape opens. No stone halls, no cloister bells, no forest shadows. Just a wide field under stars and the final stretch of your journey. But don't let the open sky fool you. This is where things get truly strange. Because now you're entering the world of ritual magic and sexual superstition, the final frontier of medieval bedroom oddities. And here, science meets spellcraft and superstition slips under the sheets. Imagine this. You live in a medieval village. You've got one pig, 3 teeth, and a crush on someone who won't even look at you. What do? If you're like many in your era, you go find the local cunning woman, a sort of witch-adjacent herbalist, fortune teller, and sometimes relationship coach. She might give you a love charm to wear, made from dried rose hips, braided hair, and a drop of menstrual blood. Romantic, right? Or she'll instruct you to bury a clove of garlic under your target's doorstep, whisper their name 3 times into your sleeve, and sleep with a turnip under your pillow. Historians still argue whether these spells were symbolic gestures or believed to literally control desire. Either way, that's one committed vegetable. Sexual superstition was everywhere, from the castle to the cottage. One popular belief, that sleeping with a virgin could cure leprosy. Yes, this actually circulated among educated people for centuries. The result? A tragic wave of abuse, especially toward young girls, justified as treatment. Disturbing? Absolutely. But it's part of the strange intersection of medicine, fear, and desire that shaped the era. And then there were fertility spells, used by women hoping to conceive or avoid pregnancy. One 14th century manuscript suggests tying a rooster feather around your thigh and reciting Psalm 31 backwards if you wanted a baby. But if you wanted to avoid pregnancy, you might swallow crushed emerald, wear a dried weasel's foot, or rub goose fat mixed with crushed ants onto your lower stomach. Goose fat. Again. Was any of it effective? No. But you can't blame them for trying. Medieval medicine was less about chemistry and more about balancing humors. Those bodily fluids said to control everything from your mood to your fertility. Sex was believed to stir the humors. But too much sex? That could cause your brain to dry out, your bones to soften, or according to one 12th century doctor, your soul to rattle loose. You pass a crumbling stone well, on it a carved symbol, a circle split with an arrow likely drawn to ward off impotence, a common fear. Men were told to drink broth made from bull's testicles, tie eel skins around their thighs, or rub crushed beetles mixed with wine into their skin. Romantic evenings clearly started with a splash and a sizzle. And what about magical protection? Oh, there was plenty. Want to keep your husband faithful? Hide a dried frog in his pillow. Want to keep your wife from wandering? Stitch her name into your undergarments using red thread blessed by a priest. Want to make someone fall in love with you? Bake bread using flour you've walked on barefoot. And maybe hair. Always the hair. Some people even believed sex itself could open portals to demonic possession, especially if performed at certain times, eclipses, full moons, or Fridays. Friday, notably, was seen as risky for everything from conception to crop rotation. A few bishops warned that lustful coupling during these times could invite demons into the womb. You wonder how many awkward silences followed that sermon. But not all magic was dark or desperate. Some rituals had a sense of celebration. In parts of Germany, couples would leap over bonfires to bless their union with fertility. In Wales, it was common to hide beneath a blanket and sing rhymed riddles to entice the spirits of passion. Some of these traditions survive in faded folklore, the roots of modern customs buried deep under centuries of superstition. And then, of course, we arrive at astral sexology. That's right. Many believed your sex drive and bedroom success were written in the stars. Birth charts were read not just to predict your fate, but to advise your ideal bedroom timing. One popular guide from the 1300s maps out which zodiac signs made the most ardent lovers. Spoiler, Aries was wild, Virgo was cold, and Scorpio. Yeah, you already knew. Even church authorities weren't above a little magical meddling. One priest in southern France was excommunicated after parishioners discovered a hidden room in his rectory filled with love philters, wax dolls, and a preserved cat heart pierced with pins. His defense: I was only trying to help the wives with their husbands. You sort of believe him. And what about the aphrodisiacs? The list gets weird fast. Boiled snails, roasted hedgehog, powdered deer horn, dried boar sweat, and a wine infused with sparrow brains. One monk even claimed a stew made from the left wing of a freshly killed bat would arouse even the most reluctant flesh. That recipe did not make it into Jamie Oliver's cookbook. You step now into a circular clearing and suddenly you recognize it. This was a ritual site, stones arranged in a spiral, symbols drawn in charcoal. This wasn't just superstition. This was theater. A performance of longing, control, hope, and fear. Because when knowledge fails, when medicine fumbles, when religion can't reach, people turn to magic, to whatever feels like it might work. And in the medieval world, sex was too powerful, Too frightening, too thrilling, not to surround with charms, whispers, and moonlit potions. You look up at the sky, no clouds, just endless stars, the same ones watched by lovers, midwives, and lonely villagers for 1,000 years. You take one last breath of the earthy night air. You've made it. Through the cloisters and the kitchens, the courts and the cottages, the desires and the denials. And now, as the wind softens and your body sinks into the earth's embrace, let's ease gently into that final stretch of rest. The stars hang quiet now, like faded silver coins scattered across midnight velvet. You breathe slowly, the night folding around you like warm fabric, soft, weightless, still. The laughter has faded. The rituals have quieted. And even the strangest secrets have settled into the hush. You feel the grass beneath your back, just cool enough to remind you you're real. A breeze moves through the leaves above like a whisper too old to translate. You hear no footsteps now. Just the rhythmic sigh of nature resting, the world finally unclenching. Let your limbs go heavy. Let your thoughts spill out and drain away. All those peculiar tales, crooked customs, whispered prayers, secret desires, they float now not as burdens but as odd human memories, half forgotten like dreams that flicker just before morning. You're not in a monastery or a village or a starlit court. You're right here, safe, still, unseen. And the only sound is your breath, slow and steady, sinking with the earth. Whatever the day held, let it go. Whatever waits tomorrow, it can wait longer. For now, there is only the soft weight of blankets, the hush between stories, the sweet ache of sleep finally arriving. Close your eyes. Drift. Fade. We've made it through the strangest of histories. And now you get to rest. Sweet dreams.